right, welcome to WSQ number 34, and this is our WSQ on reproduction in seed plants. And so today we're going to talk about a few important objectives. We're going to learn about the characteristics of gymnosperms and how they reproduce. We're going to talk about the characteristic of angiosperms and how they reproduce. And we're also going to differentiate between monocots and dicots a little bit more detail as referring to those two groups of angiosperms. So basically today's push is we're going to try to determine what's the difference between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm when we talk about the plant kingdom. So let's jump right into it. The first one we're going to talk about is a gymnosperm. Gymnosperms, as we learned earlier on a few WSQs ago, that term gymnosperm actually means naked seed. Okay, so gymnosperms are plants that produce naked seeds. Gymnosperms usually have needle-like or scale-like leaves, which are a little bit unique, and they have deep growing root systems. Those are three traits about gymnosperms that you can expect to see. Now I have in this diagram here four different groups. There's four different subdivisions of gymnosperms. We have cycads, okay, we have conifers, we have neophytes, and we have ginkgos. Okay, so cycads, conifers, neophytes, and ginkgos. And I just want to kind of real quickly talk you through what are each of these. These are the four groups. Cycads, these grow in tropical or subtropical areas. These include palm trees, all right, with large cones. All right, so an example would be like the sago palm. Is you can get that, at Costco, and a lot of people grow those at the short, squat palm tree, not the tall ones, which are actually, those would actually fit as angiosperm. But these are the cycad group, and they grow pretty good sized cones, and they typically grow in more tropical areas. That's the first group. The group that we're probably most common with, the second one, are conifers. Conifers is the largest and most diverse group of gymnosperms. These, obviously, conifer itself actually means cone bearing. The majority of conifers fit into what we'd call evergreens. That means these plants never lose their leaves, right? These are the plants that, like the pine trees and the firs and sequoias and junipers and all these plants that we think of that keep their leaves all year round. The third group are neophytes. Neophytes is kind of interesting. These are actually found in hot deserts and tropical rainforest areas. They can come in a tree or a shrub or a vine type. What we see up above right here is a welwitschia. It's hard to see from this image, but these things can actually be 10, 15 feet wide. Massive, massive. They look like a plant it looks dead, and it just kind of grows flat, and these massive leaves just kind of sprawl out, and they have these cones that grow up in the center of them. Really, really interesting, the neophyte group. And then the last group are ginkgos. There's only one species of ginkgo, and it's Ginkgo biloba. They are very tolerant trees. You've seen these. If I went to Stanislaus State, and if you go down to Stanislaus State to this day, there's a huge walkway that runs right down the middle of the school, and it has ginkgo trees on both sides. They have a very characteristic leaf. If you've ever seen a ginkgo tree, the leaf has this really kind of, I don't know, it's hard to explain, almost fan shape. I think of like the Pharaoh's fans. But ginkgos is the fourth group. So these are the groups of gymnosperms. Right, now, gymnosperms have an interesting life cycle. And their life cycle, we're talking about really how they reproduce here. If we have here on our left, we've got just an example. I'm going to show you and demonstrate this process or life cycle of the gymnosperm. On the right, I've got it in text, so we're going to kind of talk about it. The first thing that happens with a gymnosperm, and we're taking, for example, the pine tree. The first thing that they'll produce is they'll produce cones, and they'll produce male cones and female cones. Okay, so the male cones in this example here, and the female cones here. The male cone produces a particular scale, and in that scale, it will produce what's known as pollen. Okay, pollen is going to hold the male sex cells, the sperm. The female cone is produce scales like this, and at the base of those scales, it's going to actually produce ovules. Okay, in the case of a pine, it'll actually produce 2 eggs that are inside the ovule of that particular cone. Okay, of that particular scale on the cone. Wind will come along and scatter the pollen. And the pollen will get scattered throughout the forest. Some of those pollen will actually land on the female cones, and they'll land on a sticky substance that is excreted from the ovule. If you've ever held cones, you recognize they are really sticky. And then what will happen is the sperm and the egg cell, so the two egg cells, as they form the ovule, the wind scatters them, as we talk, gets trapped in the substance. Then the ovule will close as soon as it's been pollinated. Okay, the ovule will close, and a pollen grain will actually grow into one of the eggs. The sperm cell will move through that tube. It'll fertilize the egg, and after fertilization occurs, the seed will start to develop on that particular scale. We can see in this scale right here, the seed's developing right here. So as it develops into a seed, okay, then you have the zygote, right, that becomes the little embryo of that particular seed. The other parts of the ovule will develop into the seed coat, will develop into the stored food that all seeds have. And then ultimately that seed will get dispersed, okay, as pine seeds, okay, and it'll find a place where it'll land, and if it's got the appropriate soil and appropriate moisture and things like that, it will grow into another pine tree, into a sapling that could become a tree, and this whole cycle of life joins over again. So gymnosperms, as we just talked about, when we talk about the reproduction structures, the ones that should jump out to you are a few. One, cones. Cones in a gymnosperm are the reproductive structures. These come in a male and a female type, as we can see up here. There's a male and a female type in a gymnosperm. The male produces pollen, and inside the pollen is sperm, which is the male reproductive cells. The female produces ovules, and the ovules are structures that ultimately contain the ovum or the egg. And pollination is the process in which pollen gets transferred from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure. And that's the same in all cases, whether it's angiosperms or gymnosperms. You're always going to have pollination. It's the exact same process. Pollination can happen by different organisms. Bees, bugs, wasps, birds, things like that are pollinators. Wind, things like that as well. Let's move on to angiosperms. So gymnosperms, as we said, are that first class or first example of our seed vascular plants. The second group are angiosperms. Angiosperms, as we know, the word itself actually means covered seed. Angiosperms have two big parts to them, two functions. They produce flowers, and they produce seeds that are enclosed in fruits. Okay. They produce flowers, they produce seeds enclosed in fruits. Angiosperms can further be broken down into two subgroups, monocots and dicots. We've talked about this before, but I want to just quickly give you some examples. Examples of monocots would be grasses and corn, wheat, rices, lilies, tulips. Okay, monocots have flowers that are typically multiples of 3. They have leaves that generally are parallel venation, so you'll see the veins of the leaves running in a straight line. And they have stems and vascular tissue that are scattered randomly throughout. I'll show you this in a moment. Dicots on the other side, which are made up of roses and violets, dandelions, and deciduous trees. These have flowers that are usually 4 or 5, multiples of 4 or 5 petals, or multiples of 4 or 5. The leaves usually have branching veins, which are a little bit different. Okay, so like pinnate or palmate venations. And they have stems that have vascular tissue that are arranged in a ring as opposed to being randomly throughout. So monocots and dicots, we can actually see the variation by counting the petals on a flower, by looking at their leaf venation, and even cutting a stem open and looking at the way that their vascular tissue is arranged can help us to identify and classify dicots and monocots. Here's just a quick comparison chart that kind of helps you. As you look at the seed, right? The seed of a monocot has a single cotyledon, 1. Okay. The seed of a dicot has 2 cotyledons, okay, which would be 2 seed leaves. The leaf itself, parallel versus branching. This would be a branching venation. The stem, you can see that the bundles are actually scattered throughout the stem, whereas in a dicot, they're actually arranged in a particular ring, okay, around that stem. In the flower, you have parts of multiples of 3 for the monocot, and you have multiples of 4 or 5 for the dicot. So that's the difference between monocot and dicot. Now, angiosperms are important, as we said, because they produce flowers. Flowers come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors and smells, and all the differences really mean nothing. They all have the same function. The purpose of the flower is reproduction for the angiosperm. Now we need to know the structures of the flower, and you're gonna need to know this one for sure on your test and as we move on. There are basically 4 major structures I want you to understand about the flower. We'll start with the male reproductive portion of the flower is called the stamen. Okay, the stamen are the part of the flower where pollen is produced. Okay, and ultimately that pollen is going to be moved by animals, insects, wind to another flower. But that's going to happen in the anther, and there's a long stalk-like tube that holds the anther up off the base of the flower called the filament. The anther and the filament make up the stamen. So you have the anther, which sits at the top. That's where the pollen's produced. You have the filament, which holds that up high near where the insects are going to come. The female reproductive part of the flower is called the pistil. The pistil is made up of 3 different parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And we're going to take these from the bottom up. Okay. The ovary is at the base. The ovary, inside of the ovary, you would have the ovule, which will have the egg or eggs, okay, that can be fertilized and develop into the embryo. There's a tube, the style, okay. The style is just a slender tube that again holds the stigma up. This is also the route where the pollen tube originally will burrow or will actually grow. A pollen tube would grow down through the style into the ovule. And then the stigma on top is this sticky structure which basically allows pollen to attach to it. So that's the male and female portions. At the base of the flower, we have something called the sepals. The sepals are the leaf-like part of a flower that actually protect it as it develops. If you've ever seen flowers, when they first form, they have sepals tight around them, and then those sepals will pull back as the flower matures until it opens, and then you see the sepals at the end. And then the petals are just usually the most colorful portion of the flower, usually has some scent, and the patterns. The whole purpose of the petals is to attract pollinators. Okay, pollinators are those insects, birds, animals that would come to this flower and transfer pollen and to another flower to fertilize it. So those are the 4 major parts of a flower: the pistil, the stamen, the sepals, and the petals. And you should know those well and be able to diagram them, be able to understand each of those. And the importance of the flower, remember, is reproduction. The last thing we're going to talk about is reproduction in angiosperms. So we've talked about the difference between angiosperms, and what I wanted to show you really quick is how they actually reproduce. Angiosperms are similar to gymnosperm. You'll notice this process. It would start, we're talking about an apple tree here. It would start with the apple actually producing flowers. Okay, those flowers would form. You'd have the male and female reproductive portions. In the anther, pollen would be produced. In the ovary, an egg cell would be produced in each of the ovules. The pollen would get trapped on the stigma either by insects or animals or by wind. The pollen grain would then produce a tube, right, that would actually form and go into, as we see, down through the style into the ovule and the ovaries and fertilize an egg. Once the sperm and the egg cell join together in the flower's ovule, okay, you get a zygote. That's the beginning of the embryo of the plant. That embryo would start to develop, and what's starting to happen in the inside of this ovary would be the production of a seed, right? The ovule will turn into the seed, and what will develop from the rest of the ovary will actually be the fruit that will enclose the seed. And the purpose of the fruit is to help disperse the seed. Animals, humans, people come and eat the seed, right? Or eat the fruit itself, and the seed gets scattered, gets dispersed, and ultimately that seed can fall and grow into a new plant, a new tree. Okay, And that's the purpose and the process of reproduction in angiosperms. Really similar. And that cycle just continues over and over again. So that is the difference we've got between gymnosperms and angiosperms. I know that was a lot, but really important concepts that you need to understand. Would encourage you guys to, if you're confused about it, watch it again, spend some time studying it, know how flowers are structured, know the different cycles of gymnosperms and angiosperms, and I'll see you guys later. All right, bye.